He left her to marry someone else. 5 years later, he sees 2 little girls, with his eyes. Clara never imagined that a single sentence could change the entire course of her life, yet as she stood in the private office of Nicholas Ryden, surrounded by polished granite and floor-to-ceiling glass that showcased the city he ruled, she felt the air around her turn cold, sharp, and merciless. His presence once made her feel safe, adored, chosen, but now the man she loved looked at her as if she were an inconvenience blocking the path to his flawless future. He was the epitome of success, with his dark hair perfectly swept back, expensive suit tailored to perfection, and brown eyes that usually burned with ambition, but today they held nothing but irritation and impatience. She had rehearsed every possible way to tell him the truth that was growing inside her, a truth she had carried alone for weeks while searching for the courage to speak it. 2 heartbeats pulsed beneath her own, small and innocent and full of possibility. She pressed her trembling fingers against her stomach as if the touch could give her strength. She wanted to imagine his excitement, the shock followed by joy, the way he might smile and pull her into his arms while whispering that everything would be okay. Instead, her fantasy shattered before she could even open her mouth. "Don't get in my way. I'm marrying someone else." His voice was low but vicious in its finality, a statement meant to cut through any hope she might have left. He didn't shout. He didn't show anger. His indifference was worse than cruelty. Clara blinked, feeling her heart crack with a loudness she swore the entire building must have heard. She stared at him, searching for even a flicker of warmth, a sign that this was a moment he would regret, that he still remembered the nights they shared, their laughter, the way he once looked at her as if she was the only person who truly understood him. Instead, she watched him reach for his jacket with calm confidence, as if he hadn't just destroyed the life forming inside her. She stepped toward him, her lips parting, ready to speak the truth that might save them both from future suffering. Yet the words froze on her tongue when he lifted a hand slightly, already dismissing her as though she were nothing more than a mistake he wished to erase. His eyes flicked past her to his schedule on the desk, his next meeting, his next conquest in the world of power and wealth. In that moment she realized he did not see her at all. She was invisible in the story he chose to live. The hurt was so intense it almost stole her breath. Her vision swam with tears she refused to let fall, not here, not in front of him. Pride was the only shield she had left. Clara straightened her shoulders, wrapped her shaking arms tightly around herself, and forced her legs to move. She walked toward the door with as much grace as she could manage, refusing to crumble until she was far from his gaze. She paused for a split second, waiting, hoping, praying for him to call her name. He did not. She stepped out into the hallway and only then did the tears spill over, hot and uncontrollable. The world outside his office continued spinning as if nothing had happened, as if her heart wasn't lying shattered behind those closed doors. She hurried toward the exit, one hand still protectively covering her stomach. She whispered an apology to the tiny lives growing inside her, promising them silently that she would love them enough for all 3 of them, that she would fight to give them a future even if their father chose not to know them. Outside, the city lights blurred through her tears, turning the world into a smear of bright, distant dreams. She felt completely alone, terrified beyond measure, but she refused to let fear win. Clara wiped her face roughly with the back of her hand, took a deep breath that tasted like sorrow and resolve, and kept walking. Every step away from Nicholas felt like a battle against gravity, yet also a step toward something she didn't yet understand. She would not beg him to stay. She would not tell him that she carried his children. She would not allow his coldness to define her or the beautiful lives inside her. He had chosen his path. Now she would choose hers, even if she had to build it with trembling hands and a heart stitched together by nothing more than hope and fierce love. That night she curled up alone, arms wrapped protectively around her belly, listening to the quiet rhythm within her. It reminded her that she wasn't truly alone. 2 tiny miracles needed her. And she would give everything she had, even the broken pieces of her heart, to make sure they never felt the pain she felt now. The future ahead looked dark and uncertain, but Clara promised her children that she would survive it. No matter what it cost. Pregnancy was not supposed to feel like a battle, yet every day for Clara became a test of how much a human heart could endure before breaking beyond repair. She worked as many hours as her body allowed, hiding morning sickness behind a forced smile and ignoring the whispers of coworkers who noticed how pale and exhausted she had become. She never complained, because the moment she placed her hand on her growing belly, all the fear and loneliness briefly faded, replaced by an overwhelming love that gave her the strength to keep moving. She found comfort in imagining what her daughters would look like, picturing 2 tiny faces pressed against her chest, 2 pairs of hands gripping her fingers, 2 reasons to keep breathing even when life demanded more than she had. Medical bills piled up faster than she could pay them. She sacrificed meals to save money, choosing canned soup while ensuring vitamins and proper nutrition for her unborn children. She read every book on motherhood she could borrow from the library, searching for guidance that would help her raise twins alone. Nights were often sleepless, not because of discomfort, but because fear whispered that she might fail them. She never allowed those thoughts to linger. She whispered back with determination that she would become everything they needed, even if she had no one to catch her when she fell. The day the doctor told her she was expecting identical twin girls, Clara cried tears she had held inside for months. The ultrasound image showed 2 perfectly formed babies curled up together, their tiny hearts beating strongly and steadily. The doctor smiled and congratulated her, unaware that the father of those children had chosen a different family before even knowing they existed. Clara pressed the printed photo against her chest once she was alone, studying it as though memorizing proof that love still existed in her world. She made a silent promise that her daughters would always feel wanted, always feel cherished, and that no one would ever be allowed to make them doubt their worth. When Haley and Hannah were born, the delivery room filled with chaos and joy at once. Clara had no partner holding her hand, no soothing voice telling her she was doing great. Instead she clenched her jaw, screamed into the sterile ceiling, and pushed through every contraction with the primal knowledge that she was fighting for the 2 lives that depended entirely on her strength. Then, suddenly, the cries of 2 newborns filled the air, and everything else disappeared. Nurses handed her 2 squirming, pink, wailing miracles, and Clara felt her heart expand until it hurt. They were more beautiful than anything she had seen, with soft brown curls already beginning to show and wide, curious brown eyes that blinked up at her with innocence that made her chest tighten. Holding them for the first time was like finally coming home after being lost for too long. She named them Haley and Hannah, choosing names that felt strong but sweet, names she hoped would match the brave, bright futures she wanted for them. Even through exhaustion, even through the ache in her body and the fear of being alone, Clara felt a love so powerful it almost frightened her. She whispered promises into their hair, telling them she would be their mother, father, and protector. They clung to her with instinctual trust, tiny fingers wrapping around hers like anchors that kept her from drifting into despair. Motherhood was not gentle in the months that followed. Clara learned quickly that sleep became a luxury she was rarely allowed. The nights blurred into an endless cycle of feedings, crying, rocking, and diaper changes, while the days were spent working just enough to keep food on the table. She often held a baby in one arm while preparing bottles with the other, singing lullabies through sheer exhaustion. Yet every small milestone, a first smile, a tiny laugh, the way Haley always reached for Hannah's hand before falling asleep, was a reward far greater than rest or comfort. As the girls grew, their personalities bloomed like flowers in uneven sunlight. Haley was bold and energetic, always the first to crawl, the first to climb, fearless in ways that sometimes terrified Clara. Hannah was thoughtful and observant, studying everything with solemn curiosity before daring to move. Though they were identical, Clara could tell them apart instantly, not by appearance but by the way their souls seemed to shine differently. Financial struggles never relented. Clara counted every penny, sacrificing new clothes for herself, skipping medical appointments she should have attended, and refusing to ask anyone for help. Pride had become her armor, but it was her daughter's well-being that gave her reason to keep fighting. She created a home for them, small, imperfect, but full of warmth. Drawings decorated the walls, soft toys filled their bedroom, and the apartment echoed with the sound of two little girls discovering happiness in a world that expected them to have less. Sometimes, late at night, when the twins were asleep and the apartment finally quiet, Clara allowed herself to remember Nicholas. She would lie awake wondering if his life was still so perfectly aligned with his ambitions, if he would ever feel the absence of the family he didn't know he had. On those nights the ache returned, sharp and relentless, but she refused to dwell on it for long, because she had learned the most important truth: she could survive without him. Haley and Hannah were 5 years old now, bright and brilliant, two small reflections of the man who had turned his back without hesitation. Clara made sure that they never lacked love even when money was scarce. The girls thrived, their laughter loud, their spirits unbreakable, and their hearts full. They didn't know the story of their origins, and Clara hoped she could delay that difficult truth for as long as possible. She often caught herself studying their faces, thinking that the world had given her two perfect reasons to keep believing in beauty, even after the ugliest moment of her life. And while she didn't know it yet, fate was preparing to test her darkest fears and deepest hopes all over again. The past she worked so hard to outrun was not finished with her. Soon, she would stand face to face with the man she once loved. And nothing would ever be the same again. Nicholas Ryden had built a life that looked perfect from the outside, polished and shining like the skyline reflected in the glass walls of his penthouse, yet anyone who looked closer would have seen the emptiness settling behind his confident smile. After the wedding that was supposed to secure his future, he quickly learned that a marriage built on convenience and status could never satisfy a heart desperate for something real, something warm, something like the love he once threw away. His wife, Vanessa, was elegant, intelligent, and fully aligned with the world he had chosen, but love had never been part of their arrangement. Their conversations were formal, their dinners stiff and silent, and their touches always felt like business deals rather than affection. Less than 2 years after they said their vows, they signed divorce papers with the same lack of emotion that characterized everything they did together. Nicholas excelled in the one thing he still had left: work. He expanded his company's reach, collected awards, increased profits, and received admiration from everyone in the financial sector. He convinced himself that ambition was enough. He tried to believe that the empty spot in his life was simply the price of success, but each day felt more like he was performing a character rather than living a life. He attended lavish parties surrounded by people who praised him, yet he constantly found excuses to leave early, claiming urgent business matters, though in reality he couldn't stand being surrounded by laughter that didn't belong to him. He occasionally dated, mostly women who saw him as a trophy or an opportunity, but no matter how they smiled at him, he never felt drawn to any of them. He tried to bury Clara in the deepest corners of his mind, but memories of her surfaced at the most inconvenient times, refusing to disappear. He remembered her laugh, genuine and free, the way she would wrinkle her nose when she was trying not to cry, the softness in her eyes when she looked at him like he was more than the ruthless businessman he worked so hard to become. He told himself that leaving her was the right decision, that he had chosen a better path, that life was easier without the chaos of emotion. Yet the weight of regret grew heavier year after year, even though he couldn't quite understand why. Sometimes he imagined what would have happened if he had stayed. The thought made his chest squeeze uncomfortably, so he pushed it away and drowned himself in work. But as 5 years passed, something in him began to shift, slowly and without permission. He caught himself looking at families in parks, feeling a sting in his heart when he saw fathers lifting their laughing children into the air. He found himself lingering near toy stores, pretending he was just glancing at new marketing strategies, while silently imagining what gifts he might choose if he ever had a child to give them to. The idea of family, once a threat to everything he valued, now felt like the only thing missing. One day, during a meeting where his team celebrated yet another successful quarter, Nicholas felt nothing. The applause around him, the congratulations, the expensive champagne being passed out for toasts, all of it washed over him like meaningless noise. He excused himself, walking away from his own celebration and staring at his reflection in the glossy windows overlooking the city. He looked powerful, confident, enviable, and absolutely miserable. He pressed his palm against the glass, realizing with sharp clarity that he could no longer recognize the person staring back. The loneliness became suffocating. His penthouse, once a symbol of victory, now felt like a prison. The silence inside its walls grew louder each night, echoing with everything he lost and everything he never allowed himself to want. He tried calling his old friends, but conversations turned shallow within seconds. He had no one he could speak honestly to. He wondered if Clara was still in the same city, if she had moved on, if she was happy, if she hated him. He had no answers, and the not knowing gnawed at him like hunger. It wasn't until he was forced to attend a corporate event in a city park, a public relations initiative with investors, that fate decided to stop giving him time to think. As he stood with business partners discussing development plans, the sound of carefree laughter reached him from a nearby playground. At first he ignored it, but the sound grew louder, clearer, impossible to overlook. He turned toward the noise and saw two little girls racing across the grass, their joy bright and untamed, their arms stretched wide like tiny birds taking flight. Something inside him slammed to a halt. He stared, unable to look away, because those two children looked startlingly familiar. Their hair, a rich brown shade identical to his own, bounced as they ran, and when one of them turned her head, the sun caught her eyes. Brown. Deep, expressive, unmistakable. His heart lurched painfully as recognition struck him with brutal force. He knew those eyes. He'd seen them in the mirror his entire life. As his pulse thundered, he frantically searched for their mother, desperate for confirmation and terrified of the truth he already knew. And then he saw her. Clara. Standing a few feet away, watching the girls with a smile that softened every part of her face. She looked stronger, more radiant than he remembered, yet he recognized the weariness she tried to hide, the weight she carried alone. Nicholas felt his entire world tilt. 5 years of denial, ambition, and emotional distance collapsed beneath him in a single heartbeat. He understood exactly what he had done, and the knowledge almost brought him to his knees. He had walked away from the only future that ever truly mattered. And fate had just delivered the reckoning he never expected but desperately needed. Nicholas stood frozen, unable to move, hardly able to breathe as he watched the two little girls who could only be his daughters. His heartbeat pounded so loudly he wondered if anyone else could hear it. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to go to them, to fall on his knees and beg their forgiveness for not knowing, for not being there, for every lost moment he could never get back. Yet fear rooted him to the spot. What if he was wrong? What if Clara refused to let him come near them? What if those children looked up at him with confusion or fear instead of recognition and love? For the first time in his life, he understood the terror of having something to lose. Clara noticed him only after several seconds. Her smile slowly faded as her gaze followed the direction of his stare. The softness that had lit her face moments earlier vanished entirely, replaced by a wall of rigid caution and old wounds reopening in an instant. She went still, protective instinct surging through her like wildfire, and in one fluid motion she called out quietly to the girls. They both turned at her voice and immediately ran toward her, unaware of the storm brewing between the adults who once shared a life-altering connection. Clara crouched down to gather them close, one arm around each daughter, as if shielding them from a threat. Nicholas finally found the strength to step forward, though his legs felt weak and clumsy under him. The girls stared up with wide, curious eyes that matched his own, unaware of how their existence was rewriting the entire meaning of his life. He opened his mouth to speak but realized he didn't even know where to begin. The apology lodged in his throat felt far too small to cover the magnitude of his sins. At last he managed to whisper, his voice cracked and desperate, "Clara, are they?" Her eyes flashed with pain and accusation, and she straightened to her full height, pulling the girls slightly behind her legs. "Yes," she answered softly but with a razor edge that cut straight through his chest. "They are yours." She didn't shout. There was no dramatic scene, no raised voice. It was the quiet truth that broke him far more efficiently than any anger ever could. Nicholas reached for words, any words, but nothing came. The reality crushed him like a wave, cold and heavy. He looked at the girls again, truly looked, and the similarities were undeniable. Both girls held his features, his expressions, the same spark in their eyes that once burned in his own before he smothered it beneath ambition. They were 5 years old, 5 years of birthdays he missed, 5 years of first steps, first words, scraped knees, and bedtime stories he hadn't been there for. He remembered how his parents had rarely shown up for him, too busy chasing their own careers, and a nauseating dread washed over him as he realized he had done far worse. He hadn't been absent by accident but by choice. His voice was barely audible when he finally spoke. "Why didn't you tell me?" It wasn't an accusation, though it sounded dangerously close. It was a plea for a reason that would be easier to accept than the truth he already feared. Clara let out a shaky breath, and her fingers clenched protectively around Haley's shoulder. "The day I tried to tell you, you made it very clear I didn't matter," she said with painful calm. "You walked away before I could say anything. I wasn't going to beg." Her voice cracked on the last word despite her effort to stay composed. Nicholas flinched as if struck. He remembered that day now with searing clarity, his own cruel words echoing back to him like a courtroom verdict. He had sentenced himself to this fate long before he even understood the consequences. Regret coursed through him violently, tinged with shame that left him breathless. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the apology sounding far too small, inadequate for the ocean of pain he had inflicted. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the powerful CEO she once loved but a man suddenly stripped of his certainty and arrogance. Her expression softened only slightly, but her anger was still there, simmering beneath every syllable. "Sorry doesn't change anything," she replied quietly. "They've grown up without a father. I raised them alone. They don't know you. They don't even know your name." The girls tugged at her clothes, sensing the tension but not understanding its source, and Clara gently stroked their hair to reassure them. Nicholas watched that gesture with an ache so sharp he nearly staggered. This was a family he had never known, a bond he had no right to break but so desperately wanted to be part of. Something inside him shifted permanently in that moment. Power, success, wealth, none of it mattered if he remained a stranger to the two hearts that should have been his greatest pride. He swallowed hard and forced himself to speak, each word emerging with raw sincerity. "I don't deserve a second chance," he admitted. "But I'm begging you, let me try. Let me know them. Let me make up whatever I can." His voice cracked with the weight of that plea. He had never begged in his life. Pride had once been his shield, but now it lay shattered at her feet. Clara's expression reflected an emotional storm. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't trying to punish him. She was simply terrified that letting him near their daughters meant risking everything she fought to protect. "I need time," she finally said, her voice a fragile thread. "I need to think about what's best for them." Nicholas nodded, accepting even that small mercy as a lifeline. Before he could say anything more, Haley and Hannah tugged at Clara's hands, wanting to go back to playing. Clara gave him one last look, filled with unresolved questions and memories too painful to revisit, then turned away. Nicholas stood rooted in place as he watched them leave, his daughters glancing back curiously over their shoulders, unaware that their gaze was reshaping his entire destiny. The distance between them grew with each step, but Nicholas felt something new and powerful ignite inside him, a determination he had never experienced before. He would not disappear again. He would not let go this time. He had already lost 5 years. He refused to lose another second. For the first time in his life, Nicholas Ryden understood what it meant to fight for something that truly mattered. And he intended to fight with everything he had. Nicholas left the park that day a different man than the one who had walked into it. The world around him moved as usual, cars passing, children laughing, business meetings waiting, but inside him something had shifted so drastically that it felt as though the ground beneath his feet no longer belonged to him. Everything he had spent years building suddenly felt meaningless compared to the 5 years of life he missed with his daughters. He returned to his office, not to bury himself in work, but to sit in silence at his desk while the same question repeated endlessly in his mind: what kind of man had he been to walk away from the very people who should have mattered most? Sleep became impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Haley and Hannah staring up at him with innocent curiosity and no understanding of who he was. He would picture Clara's protective stance, the pain in her eyes, and the exhaustion she must have carried alone for years. Guilt consumed him until he could barely recognize the version of himself he had once been so proud of. He began revisiting old choices, recalling every moment he pushed her away, all the missed calls when she tried reaching out before giving up entirely. The realization that she had tried, and he had not even listened, crushed him in a way that success had never been able to fix. Nicholas spent weeks trying to earn even the smallest sliver of trust from Clara. He reached out carefully, respecting her distance, sending messages instead of showing up unannounced, offering help without expecting gratitude. At first, Clara refused everything. She had spent too many nights proving she didn't need him to survive. She didn't want the girls to get attached to someone who might leave again if life became inconvenient. Still, Nicholas persisted, not with arrogance, but humility he had never known before. He asked about the girls' favorite snacks, their hobbies, their schedules. He offered to help with school expenses, medical checkups, anything that might lighten her burden. Clara tested him repeatedly. She questioned his intentions, demanded proof that his involvement wasn't a fleeting impulse fueled by guilt. Nicholas accepted every challenge she presented, determined to show that he wasn't just trying to mend his conscience but ready to become a father in every sense. Slowly, cautiously, Clara allowed small interactions, starting with him meeting the girls in public places like playgrounds or cafes, where she remained close enough to intervene if anything went wrong. The first meeting was awkward and tense. Haley stared at him boldly, studying his face with the intense curiosity of a child trying to understand something complicated. Hannah stayed closer to Clara, clutching her hand tightly, peeking out from behind her mother's hip. Nicholas didn't push. He sat down on the grass, lowering himself to their level, and waited patiently while they continued assessing him. When he pulled out a coloring book and crayons, Haley cautiously approached, plopping down beside him as if challenging him to keep up with her imagination. Nicholas drew a clumsy cat, and she laughed at him, the sound so pure it hit him like sunlight breaking through a storm. Hannah eventually joined them, placing herself on Nicholas's right side, still watching him with a guarded heart. He wasn't offended by her hesitation. If anything, he admired her carefulness, a trait she must have inherited from the resilience Clara had developed. When the meeting ended, the girls waved at him, small movements filled with brand new familiarity. That simple gesture made Nicholas feel more victorious than signing any multimillion-dollar deal ever had. Days turned into weeks, and Nicholas carved out more time for his daughters, prioritizing them above everything else. He rearranged his schedule, canceled business trips, and let his assistant handle meetings that once demanded his full attention. He bought booster seats for his car, filled his phone with pictures Clara sent of the girls' artwork and their silly expressions. He learned their favorite cartoons, the name of the teddy bear Haley refused to sleep without, and the exact way Hannah liked having her hair brushed. He learned that Haley loved climbing and exploring, always running a little too far ahead, while Hannah collected tiny treasures like rocks and bottle caps which she kept in an old lunchbox as if they were diamonds. For the first time since his childhood, Nicholas allowed himself to laugh without restraint, to feel without shame, to open his heart even when fear whispered he could still lose everything. The girls, despite their initial hesitation, began trusting him in small, precious doses. Their acceptance of him was not dramatic or sudden, it came through everyday moments, Haley grabbing his hand without thinking, Hannah crawling into his lap during a movie, both girls calling his name when something exciting happened and wanting him to see it too. Clara watched every interaction, her heart torn between happiness and dread. Watching Nicholas love their daughters made part of her ache in ways she wasn't prepared for. She had spent years convincing herself that she was enough, that being a single mother was a strength. But now, seeing how the girls' eyes lit up when Nicholas arrived, she realized how much they had missed, how much she had tried to shield them from wanting something she believed they could never have. One rainy afternoon, after a particularly emotional day where the girls begged for Nicholas to stay longer, Clara asked him to talk. He expected another boundary, another warning, but instead she said something that terrified both of them. She admitted she was afraid. Afraid he would leave again. Afraid the girls would love him only to lose him. Afraid that she would love him again too, and that the heartbreak would destroy her this time. Nicholas listened with his heart wide open. He didn't defend himself, didn't interrupt, didn't try to justify his past. When she finally fell silent, bracing herself for his response, he stepped closer and said that he wasn't leaving, not when things were hard, not when people expected him to, not ever again. He confessed that he had never been strong before, not truly, because he ran from the only person who ever made him want to be better. He told her that the girls had changed him, that their existence taught him what love truly meant. Clara didn't believe him instantly, but she didn't push him away either. She simply whispered that she needed time, the same way he needed forgiveness. And without hesitation, Nicholas said he would wait. Whether it took months, years, or the rest of his life, he would wait. Because for the first time, he understood that love was not something earned through success or status, it was built through showing up, again and again, even when fear threatened to tear everything apart. He had already lost 5 years. He would not lose them again. Nicholas never imagined that learning to be a father would feel like stepping into an entirely new world where every emotion was amplified, every mistake felt monumental, and every success filled his chest with a warmth he had never known. He threw himself into fatherhood with the same determination he once reserved for business, but this time the stakes were far more personal. He discovered that parenting 2 energetic 5-year-olds was both chaotic and miraculous, a constant roller coaster of spilled juice, tangled hair, laughter that could erase the worst day, and tears that could reduce him to panic in seconds. He learned quickly that children did not care about his powerful reputation or his intimidating presence. What mattered to them was whether he showed up, whether he knelt on the floor instead of staying above their world, whether he listened when they spoke in their fast, excited voices about dreams that made no logical sense. At first, every interaction felt like a test he was doomed to fail. Haley would push boundaries, racing ahead in grocery stores or climbing anything taller than she was, forcing Nicholas to run after her with frantic urgency that made onlookers smile knowingly. Hannah needed reassurance in almost every moment, clinging to his sleeve if strangers passed too close or asking him to check the closet 3 times before bed. Nicholas had to learn patience, gentle guidance, and how to kneel down to eye level so Hannah wouldn't feel overwhelmed. He found himself reading parenting articles at 2 in the morning, highlighting sections about emotional support, communication, and trauma caused by absence. Every mistake weighed heavily on him. The first time the girls called him Dad, the word sounded hesitant, as if they were afraid to give it freely. Nicholas spent the rest of the night sitting on his living room couch staring into the dark, overwhelmed by gratitude and guilt tangled so tightly he couldn't separate them. Clara watched his efforts with quiet suspicion. Trust did not grow quickly for her, but she saw how Nicholas changed his priorities without hesitation. Every afternoon he arrived early at the park or activity center where they met, often carrying their favorite snacks and greeting them with a smile that reached his eyes. He celebrated their smallest accomplishments as if they were grand victories, clapping wildly when Haley mastered a new climbing bar and kneeling proudly when Hannah read her first full sentence from a children's book. There were times when Clara caught him staring at their daughters with such pure, aching love that it made her breath catch, because she recognized that look. It was the one she once wished he would give her. One evening, everything changed in a way none of them predicted. Clara had allowed Nicholas to take the girls to the playground alone for the first time, wanting to encourage the bond they were still building. The night was supposed to be simple, filled with swings and fairy tale games, but a sudden summer storm rolled in, bringing loud cracks of thunder that terrified Hannah. The child bolted in panic, running straight toward the darkening trees. Haley called after her, but Hannah was too scared to listen. Nicholas chased her with a fear that tore through him more violently than anything he had ever faced in the business world. He finally reached her behind a thick bush where she crouched crying, covering her ears as thunder boomed overhead. He sank to his knees, his suit drenched from the sudden rain, and wrapped his arms around her, whispering soft words and shielding her from each rumble. He wasn't calm or composed, he was terrified, heart-pounding, terrified of losing her in a way that went far beyond physical danger. When Hannah finally looked up at him with tear-streaked cheeks and threw her arms around his neck, Nicholas realized that trust wasn't something he earned through perfect actions but through showing up during the messy, frightening moments when love meant staying even in the storm. By the time Clara arrived in a rush, hair soaked and panic visible in her trembling hands, she found Hannah nestled against Nicholas's chest while Haley clung to his arm for comfort. The sight of her daughters choosing him as their safety shook her heart more deeply than she expected. Clara thanked him with a voice she could barely steady, and Nicholas simply nodded, afraid that any words might lead him to break down. Driving home that night, Clara replayed the scene in her mind over and over, realizing that he had been there when it mattered most. She saw how his hands still shook long after the girls were calm, how he looked at them like they were the most fragile and precious treasures in the world. A part of her, the part she had tried so hard to bury, began to soften in ways she wasn't ready to admit. Over time, Clara learned to share responsibilities with him. He started helping with bedtime routines, reading bedtime stories where his deep voice gave life to dragons and princesses. Hannah began falling asleep curled against his side, comforted by the steady rhythm of his breathing. Haley insisted he tuck her in last, claiming she needed the strongest hug before sleeping. On certain evenings, after the girls were safely dreaming, Clara and Nicholas sat together in the living room, talking quietly about school plans, future birthdays, and challenges the girls might face. Those conversations were cautious yet intimate, like two people learning to trust language again without letting old wounds speak too loudly. Nicholas often looked at Clara with a mix of admiration and remorse, seeing her not as the girl he once walked away from but as a woman who survived heartbreak and turned it into the warm, loving environment their daughters thrived in. He wondered if she knew how extraordinary she was, how her strength humbled him every single day. Sometimes she caught him watching her with that expression, and she would quickly look away, afraid of what it meant. Deep down, they both understood that the path they were walking was delicate. Past pain still lingered like a shadow between them, but something new was growing quietly beneath it, something hopeful, something terrifying, something that could either heal everything or destroy them completely. Clara still carried fear, but she also carried a spark of possibility. Nicholas carried regret, but he also carried a love so fierce it left no room for abandonment ever again. The girls were learning what family felt like for the first time. Nicholas was learning what it meant to be worthy of one. And Clara was learning that healing did not mean forgetting, but allowing herself to believe in a future she once thought impossible. They were changing together. Slowly, painfully, beautifully. Time continued to press forward, blending days into weeks as the fragile structure of trust slowly rebuilt itself, but even as Nicholas became a consistent part of their lives, Clara carried a fear she could not silence. The fear crept into her thoughts in the quiet hours of the night. What if he left again? What if this was temporary? What if the girls gave him their whole hearts only to watch him walk away the moment responsibility grew too heavy? She had spent years teaching herself to never expect help, to never rely on anyone but herself. Now she was watching her children attach themselves to the very man who once chose a future without them, and it terrified her more than the loneliness ever had. Nicholas understood that he would always walk through a minefield of mistrust when it came to Clara. Every mistake he made felt magnified, every hesitation became a reminder of the past. Sometimes she flinched when he raised his voice accidentally while calling the girls, not in anger but to get their attention. Sometimes she tensed when he mentioned work, as if expecting him to say he had to leave again for something more important. He noticed all of it. He noticed the way her smile grew cautious whenever deeper feelings threatened to show. He noticed how she sat slightly angled away from him when they talked, as if protecting her heart with her posture. He didn't blame her for any of it. Every bit of her distance was a wound he had caused. He sought help in ways he once believed were beneath him. He attended therapy, determined to dismantle the emotional armor he wore for so long. He unpacked his upbringing where affection was rare, where success equaled love, where career goals were the only thing that earned praise. He confronted fears he hadn't known he carried, discovering how deeply he had equated vulnerability with danger. He learned that opening his heart to love did not make him weak, shutting love out did. Meanwhile, Clara began to notice subtle changes in him that she couldn't ignore. He never missed a day with the girls, even when he was sick or exhausted. He showed up to every parent-teacher meeting, every dance recital and sports event, cheering with the loudest voice in the room. He took the twins to the park on weekends, spending hours pushing swings, building sandcastles, and listening to their endless stories. He was there not only during celebrations but also through meltdowns, tantrums, and scraped knees, always patient, always present, always learning. One evening, after putting the girls to sleep, Clara found Nicholas still in the living room, sitting on the couch with a children's book open on his lap. He looked heartbreakingly sincere and tired, dark circles forming under his eyes from long days juggling work and fatherhood, but he also carried a soft contentment she had never seen in him before. Without thinking, Clara joined him on the couch, leaving comfortable space between them, and they began talking quietly. She confessed that every time she saw him care for their daughters, something inside her shifted in a way she couldn't control. He listened closely, never interrupting, giving her the room to say everything she had swallowed for years. When she finished, he admitted that he had never stopped thinking about her after they parted and that the emptiness he lived with was his punishment for choosing ambition over love. The confessions left the air thick with emotion neither of them knew how to handle. Part of Clara wanted to lean into him, to allow her heart to reconnect with what it once believed was her forever. Another part of her wanted to run, because loving him again would mean trusting that he would never abandon them. Nicholas saw that conflict in her eyes and reached out gently, his voice low and steady as he said he did not expect forgiveness overnight. He understood that trust was not something requested, it was something earned through consistency and time. He promised he would keep showing up, even on the days she doubted him most. Weeks later, Clara invited Nicholas to her home for dinner, marking a significant shift in their dynamic. It was the first time the girls saw both parents seated at the same table, sharing food, laughter, and stories like a family that never fell apart. The evening flowed naturally, with Haley proudly showing Nicholas her newest drawing and Hannah asking him to help her cut her food. Clara watched from across the table, her heart swelling and trembling all at once, because the picture in front of her was so beautifully ordinary, something she dreamed of but feared she'd never have. As the girls played after dinner, Clara and Nicholas stood near the kitchen sink, cleaning dishes side by side. The simple domesticity of the moment wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Clara finally dared to say that she didn't want to run anymore, that she could see the man he was now, and that her heart was no longer refusing to feel. Nicholas exhaled shakily, relief flooding his expression, and he told her she deserved happiness and peace, and he wanted to spend his life providing both if she would let him. Even then, shadows of the past lingered, reminding them that healing was not linear. There were days Clara woke up terrified for no reason, days when Nicholas questioned whether he was enough, days when guilt threatened to devour any progress they made. But their love was becoming a force neither of them could ignore anymore, reborn from pain, rooted in growth, and nurtured by the two little girls who unknowingly tied their parents' hearts together every single day. Clara was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could survive even the deepest wounds if two people fought hard enough to rebuild it. And Nicholas was determined to prove that he would never again be the man who walked away. The family they once lost was slowly, beautifully forming right in front of them, piece by fragile piece, guided by love that refused to disappear. Nicholas knew he wanted to spend the rest of his life with Clara long before he gathered the courage to put that desire into words. Every moment with her and the girls taught him what it truly meant to love someone, not through grand gestures or perfect timing, but through consistency, vulnerability, and the willingness to show up even when fear whispered that everything could still fall apart. He had lost them once because he chose comfort over courage, he would not repeat that mistake now. He planned his proposal with a care rooted not in extravagance, but in meaning, wanting each second to reflect how much his heart had changed and how deeply he cherished the family forming around him. He asked Clara if they could take the girls to the botanical gardens on a warm Saturday afternoon, a place filled with winding paths, bright flowers, and fountains that sparkled beneath the sun. Clara agreed, unaware of the ring hidden in his pocket, the promise waiting to unfold. The twins skipped ahead of them, holding hands and laughing at butterflies fluttering through the air, while Clara and Nicholas walked closely behind, their fingers brushing every so often in ways that sent soft waves of warmth through both of them. The day felt peaceful, almost dreamlike, as if the world itself approved of the future they were building. They reached a secluded garden filled with soft pink roses and a small pond where koi fish glided lazily through the clear water. The girls raced to the edge, pointing excitedly at the fish while Nicholas guided Clara toward a wooden bench beneath a flowering archway. She sat beside him, still smiling as she watched the twins, unaware that her life was about to shift again in the most beautiful way. He turned to face her fully, his expression no longer casual, but brimming with emotion she felt before he even spoke. Her heart began to tremble inside her chest, sensing that something important was coming. Nicholas told her that there were moments in his life when he believed success required emotional armor, moments when he convinced himself that love was a weakness he couldn't afford. He admitted that walking away from her had been the greatest mistake he would ever make, one that haunted him every day until he found her again. He said that meeting their daughters changed the entire structure of his soul and that they taught him what love really meant, loving deeply even when it terrified him. He reached for the small velvet box in his pocket, his hands trembling, not from fear of rejection but from the sheer weight of hope pressing against his heart. Clara's breath caught in her throat as Nicholas sank to one knee before her. It felt unreal, like the universe was stitching all her broken pieces together right there under the blooming archway. The twins turned to watch, their eyes widening with excitement as they sensed this moment was important. Hannah grabbed Haley's hand tightly and whispered something that made both girls grin from ear to ear. Nicholas held out the open box, revealing a delicate ring that shimmered like captured sunlight, but it was his voice that contained the true beauty of the moment. He told her he didn't want to erase the past, because the past shaped the strength she carried and the love she gave so fiercely. He promised that he would spend the rest of his life proving that he was now the man she deserved, a man who would never again choose ambition over family. He asked her to marry him not just for his happiness, but because he wanted to be the husband she could lean on, the father their daughters could always count on, and the partner whose loyalty would never falter again. His voice broke as he told her he loved her, not as a confession from a desperate man, but as a truth that would guide everything he did from this moment forward. Clara's tears fell freely, her heart swelling with more love than she thought she was capable of feeling ever again. All the years of struggling alone, all the nights questioning if she would ever find light after heartbreak, suddenly made sense, because they had led her back to the place where love could finally bloom without fear. She said yes with a voice full of hope, trembling yet sure. The twins squealed and launched themselves into their parents' arms, wrapping the four of them into a group hug that felt like a promise sealed not only by words, but by a bond that would never again break. They didn't rush to the next step. Instead, they savored every moment that followed, planning a small ceremony where the girls could be the ones to walk their mother down the aisle, choosing a home that belonged to all of them equally, and creating new traditions that felt like tiny celebrations of their healing. On the day they exchanged vows, Clara walked toward Nicholas with their daughters at her sides, each holding one of her hands. She met his eyes with confidence and peace. When they promised each other forever, it wasn't the beginning of a new story, it was the continuation of one that refused to die, even when it fractured. After the reception, Nicholas twirled his daughters around the dance floor while Clara watched with tears of quiet joy. He finally understood what it meant to be whole. She finally felt like her heart was safe. And the girls finally had both parents living under one roof, loving them with everything they had. Their journey hadn't been perfect. It had been painful, messy, overwhelming, and terrifying. But because they fought through every hardship instead of giving up, they emerged stronger than before. They learned that sometimes love doesn't arrive flawlessly, sometimes it returns after breaking, determined to rebuild itself into something unshakable. The life they created was proof that love can survive mistakes, that forgiveness can grow where pain once ruled, and that second chances are worth risking everything for when the heart finally chooses what truly matters. Their family was no longer divided by the past. Their future now belonged to all four of them.